There is nothing you need to hold on to tonight. Whatever the day brought with it, its noise, its weight, its unresolved edges, you're allowed to set it down here, at the threshold of this story. Let your breathing slow. Let the muscles behind your eyes soften. You're not going anywhere that requires speed. The world you're entering has existed for thousands of years, patient as stone, and it will still be here when you open your eyes again. For now, there is only the darkness behind your lids and the slow drift of a voice that knows the way. The story we're following tonight is one of blood. Not blood in the violent sense, though violence does shadow it, as violence shadows most things of consequence in this world. This is blood in the older sense. Blood as inheritance, blood as covenant, blood as the invisible thread that pulls a life in directions the living soul did not choose and cannot always understand. It is the story of a young woman who was born carrying something she did not ask for, something that older and more powerful forces had been waiting on for longer than she had been alive. Her name, in the language of the people who shaped her earliest years, was Cirilla. The world would shorten it, soften it, make it more intimate. Ciri. A small sound for an enormous weight. But before Ciri herself, there must be the elder blood. There must be the source. There must be the long patience of a thing that predates almost everything else in this story. Older than the kingdoms that hunted her, older than the monster hunters who roamed the roads, older even than the great conjunction of the spheres that fused multiple worlds into one terrible, fertile, catastrophic whole. The elder blood is not a bloodline in the way a dynasty is a bloodline. It does not simply pass down the colour of eyes or the shape of a jaw. It passes down something that sits closer to the architecture of reality itself. Long before the world as Ciri knew it had taken its current shape, long before Nilfgaard had risen from the southern dust, before the northern kingdoms had drawn their borders in ink and defended them in iron, before even the founding of the great schools of witches, which is itself already a very long time ago indeed, there was an elvish civilization of staggering complexity. These were the Ensader, the elves who arrived on the continent aboard ships from a world that no longer exists in any form we could visit, and their cousins, the NL, who found their own path through the fabric of reality to a world of silver and cold twilight. Let that thought settle for a moment. Let it breathe. These were peoples who understood that reality was not a single room, but a house of many chambers, and they moved through it accordingly. The NL possessed mages of extraordinary power, and among those mages there were those who specialized in something that did not have a clean name in any human tongue, the ability to perceive and navigate the spaces between worlds. They called this knowledge, this art, this gift, and it was as much a gift as a curse, by a term that roughly translates as the gift of the elder. It was not teachable in any straightforward sense. It lived in the gene, not the school. It passed mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, sometimes skipping generations, sometimes manifesting weakly, and sometimes with a roar that shook the practitioners themselves loose from their moorings in ordinary time. The genetic lineage that carried this gift most reliably was old even by elvish reckoning. It traced back to a woman whose name has been carried forward through millennia in fragmentary elvish texts and half-translated genealogies, Lara Dorren ep Shiadal. It is worth pausing on that name for a moment, the way you might pause on an inscription carved into a very old stone, the letters worn but still legible, still meaningful, still pointing towards something that mattered once and never entirely stopped mattering. Lara Dorren. She was not a queen, not precisely, though she was born among those who held power. She was something closer to what you might call a vessel, not in any passive sense, but in the sense that certain kinds of fire need a particular kind of material in which to burn without consuming everything around them. Lara Dorren loved a human mage. This is where the story that eventually produces Ciri takes its most consequential early turn, and it is a turn that contains within it all the sadness and complication that attends any love that crosses lines others have decided should not be crossed. His name was Cregennan of Lod, a human, a mage of real ability, and a man who clearly understood what he was reaching for when he reached for her. Their union was not celebrated on either side of the divide between their peoples. The elves saw in it a dilution of something they considered precious. The humans saw in it a transgression. Both sides, as is common with groups who define themselves by their separateness, were wrong in the most deeply boring way. wrong with the confidence that comes from never having had to question the framework that made them feel superior. What mattered for our purposes, for the long thread we are following through the dark, is that Lara Dorren carried the elder blood in its most concentrated living form, and that when she and Crianan produced a child, that elder blood did not vanish. It did not dilute into insignificance. It adapted. It folded itself into a half-human genome and waited. The elvish texts that survive from this period, and they are few, because the centuries since have been unkind to elvish records for reasons that include human hands and human fires, suggest that the ANL understood immediately what had happened and what it meant. They had lost, or rather been denied, their most powerful living channel for the gift, and it had passed to a line that would blend further and further into humanity with each generation. This is the mechanism then, but the mechanism is not the mystery. The mystery is why this matters so enormously, why powerful forces across multiple worlds spent centuries monitoring, manipulating, and eventually hunting the descendants of Lara Dorren. The answer lives in what the elder blood actually enables at its most potent expression. The gift is not merely an aptitude for magic, not merely a sensitivity to the flow of power, not merely an ability to move between worlds, though it encompasses all of these. At its deepest, most concentrated, most fully realized expression, the elder blood confers something that borders on the terrifying. The ability to perceive and manipulate the very structure of time, not to travel freely through it, not to rewrite history like an editor crossing out words, but to feel the branching points, to sense where one reality diverges from another, to stand at the hinge of things and feel the weight of every path not taken. It is difficult to sit with that without feeling something shift in the chest, an ability to touch time, to feel its grain the way a woodworker feels the grain in a plank, not controlling it entirely, but knowing it so intimately that certain things become possible that are impossible for hands less attuned. No wonder the NLA wanted it back. No wonder those who understood what they were looking at would spend generations in patient pursuit, and no wonder the young woman who eventually inherited this gift in its fullest waking form would spend most of her early life running, without fully understanding why the world seemed to lean toward her with such urgent hunger. Let your breathing stay slow and even. There is no urgency here. This is simply a story, and it has been waiting a long time to be told to someone who would listen carefully. The elder blood is the root of everything that follows. The ancient foundation beneath the life of a girl from Cintra, who liked horses and had no idea in her earliest years that she was carrying within her the most coveted genetic inheritance in the known world. The history preceded her. The prophecy preceded her. The hunger of kings and sorcerers and elvish lords preceded her by such vast stretches of time that the weight of it, laid out fully, becomes almost geological in its scale. And yet she was also simply a person, simply a girl who loved her grandmother and knew the smell of the sea and the sound of Cintra's harbour at dawn. The cosmic and the personal were always both true of her, always running in parallel, always in tension, the vast forces of destiny on one side, and on the other a human heart that wanted ordinary things. The story of Ciri is, in many ways, the story of what happens when those two truths refuse to separate, when the universe insists on making a person into something mythological, and the person in question has no interest in being mythological. She had no interest in being a vessel. She wanted to be a daughter. Let that thought stay with you as we move deeper into the night. The elder blood did not ask her permission. It never asks. It simply runs, generation by generation through the centuries, like a river that has no concern for the particular landscape it passes through, carving, shaping, wearing down the stone, persistent beyond any individual life's ability to comprehend or redirect. By the time Ciri was born, the river had been running for several thousand years. By the time Geralt of Rivia found himself bound to her by a custom older than most kingdoms, the river had been running longer than the kingdom of Cintra itself had existed. This is the deep time we are working with tonight. This is the slow, enormous patience of the blood. Settle a little more deeply into wherever you are resting. Feel the surface beneath you. Let the story carry you now, as it will carry you through the night, through 10 chapters of a life so entangled with destiny that the two became indistinguishable. There is nothing you need to do. There is nothing you need to solve. The blood runs, the story continues, and in the darkness of this night you can let it wash over you the way deep water washes over a stone. cool, consistent, and profoundly unhurried. The elder blood is the beginning, and the beginning is always, in the end, a place of rest. There is a particular quality to the ancient, the truly ancient, that separates it from everything merely old. The old can be restored, renovated, repaired by hands that understand what it was before it was worn. The ancient is past restoration. It is past the point where human intervention can meaningfully adjust it. The elder blood sits in this category. It predates the oldest institutions of the world Ciri inhabited, predates the oldest religious traditions, predates the oldest borders and the oldest grudges and the oldest stars visible from the continent's shores. To understand it requires the willingness to hold a timeline so vast that the years composing it become something other than years. They become something more like geology. What the NLA brought with them when they arrived on the continent, carried in their ships, their language, their bodies, their memories of the world left behind, was a civilization of considerable depth. They had been building for millennia before their arrival, had developed philosophies of reality that make the equivalent human traditions look like preliminary sketches, had accumulated knowledge of magic not merely as a technique, but as an understanding of the fundamental architecture of existence. They knew that matter was porous. They knew that the boundaries between states of being were not walls but membranes, and that membranes could be crossed by those with the sensitivity to feel their texture and the strength to push through. Lara Dorren's particular gift, the gift she carried and then passed into a mixed lineage that would carry it forward into human history, was not simply the ability to feel those membranes. It was the ability to move through them with intention, with direction, with something approaching navigation. This is a distinction that sounds subtle until you consider its implications. A person who can feel the boundary between worlds, but cannot cross it intentionally, is simply aware of something most people cannot perceive. A person who can cross with intention is something else entirely. A key, a bridge, a living passage between states of reality that were otherwise separated by distances that no physical movement could cover. The descendant who would eventually fully activate this capability was not guaranteed to exist. The geneticists among the NL, and they had people who studied such things in their own terms with their own frameworks, understood that the expression of the elder blood in mixed lineages was not deterministic. It could weaken. It could become recessive, submerged beneath the dominant characteristics of the human blood that surrounded it generation by generation. It could produce partial expressions, people with enhanced sensitivity or limited magical capability, without ever producing the full flowering that the original gift had represented in Lara Dorren herself. The monitoring they maintained of the lineage was rooted in this uncertainty. They were watching to see whether the fire would hold or gradually go out. Let your body be heavy. Let the thoughts that still want your attention drift to the edges of awareness, where they can wait without urgency, without the sharpness they carry in daylight. You are safe here. You are resting. And the story is patient. It has been patient for longer than either of us can reasonably measure. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from being inside a very old story, from the recognition that the thing you are hearing has been heard before, across fires and in the dark, and that its surviving to reach you tonight is itself a kind of grace. The law of surprise is one of those customs so old that no one alive in Ciri's time knew with certainty where it had first been spoken. It was older than the northern kingdoms. It was older than Nilfgaard, though Nilfgaard would eventually position itself as the arbiter of all things ancient. It may have been older than the presence of humans on the continent altogether, though that is a claim that cannot be verified and is probably best held lightly. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this. By the time Geralt of Rivia was born into a world that had not yet fully decided what to do with people like him, the law of surprise was simply there, embedded in the social fabric the way certain phrases become embedded in a language, so thoroughly present that speakers forget they are using a figure of speech at all. The custom worked like this. When one person saved another's life, whether by lifting a sword in their defence, or by pulling them from a river, or by providing some other service of comparable weight, the rescued party could offer, and the rescuer could accept, what the custom called the law of surprise. In its simplest formulation, the saved person promised to give the one who saved them the first unexpected thing they found, waiting for them upon their return home. This sounds vague. It is meant to sound vague. The vagueness is the point, because the custom was never really about property or wealth, or even obligation in any transactional sense. It was about fate. It was about acknowledging that life was not something you owned outright, that when your life was given back to you by another person's action, the universe had an opinion about what that debt looked like. In practice, the unexpected thing waiting at home was sometimes an object. A litter of unexpected piglets born while the farmer was away, a harvest more abundant than predicted, a piece of good fortune the shape of which could not have been foreseen. And in those cases, the law of surprise was a relatively contained affair, an exchange of goods with a ceremonial weight that acknowledged something beyond commerce. But sometimes, and this is where the law of surprise reveals its deepest teeth, what waited at home was a child, a pregnancy that had not been known, a child born in the father's absence, a life that arrived at precisely the moment when the universe, as if it had been listening, chose to produce the most significant unexpected thing possible. It is worth pausing here. It is genuinely worth letting the mind slow and sit with what this means, not as an abstract cultural curiosity, but as a cosmological claim about the nature of reality. The law of surprise, at its most profound, is a statement that fate exists and that it is participatory. That when you invoke it, you're not merely making a social promise, but opening a channel. You're saying, whatever the universe has prepared for me, I offer to you. And in a world where magic was real, where witches walked roads that no ordinary person could survive, where sorcerers bent the laws of nature as a matter of professional routine, this was not a metaphor. The universe in that world did seem to have opinions. It did seem to lean towards certain outcomes, and it seemed to find the law of surprise a particularly useful instrument. Geralt of Rivia invoked this custom more than once in his long career. The roads he walked produced encounters that called for it repeatedly, as though the universe were offering him multiple chances to take hold of the thread it was extending. The one that bound him most completely came in Cintra, during an encounter with a knight named Duni, who had come to claim his betrothed, a princess named Pavetta, daughter of Queen Calanthe, under circumstances that required Geralt's intervention to avoid bloodshed. The details of the encounter are layered and strange, as things tend to be when Geralt is present, but the outcome was this. Geralt, who had not intended to invoke the law of surprise at all, who had almost used the word gold before something shifted in him, and the older phrase came out instead, found himself the recipient of the unexpected. Pavetta was already carrying a child. Duni did not know. Calanthe did not know. The child who would eventually become Ciri was not yet born, barely yet begun in the world, and already the thread of her life had been attached to the life of a witcher who had not asked for her, and who would spend years refusing to collect what destiny had apparently decided he was owed. The child surprised everyone, including her own parents. And that surprise was the precise mechanism by which the law of surprise operated. The universe had, as it were, agreed. Think about what that means for Ciri as a person growing up not knowing this history, not knowing that before she had drawn her first breath there was already a man she had never met who was, by ancient custom, and perhaps by something even older than custom, responsible for her. She was already a promise kept before she understood that promises had been made. She was already a destination before she had taken a single step. The law of surprise had preceded her into the world by months, and it would shape the entire trajectory of her early life, without her ever having been consulted about whether she wanted to be shaped. This is one of the places where Ciri's story touches something that extends beyond the particular world she inhabits. Every person arrives into a web of decisions, promises, and inheritances that predate them entirely. Parents chose each other before we existed. Nations drew borders in blood before we were born into them. Languages were shaped by people long dead, carrying within them assumptions and beauties and violences that we inherit without choosing. Ciri simply had a more literal version of this universal condition. She had a guardian chosen for her by a ritual, and the ritual had the weight of something that felt like fate because in her world it very nearly was. Geralt refused to collect his child of surprise for years. He was not a man who trusted destiny, not least because his entire existence as a witcher had been shaped by a parental decision that was itself a kind of law of surprise in reverse. His mother had surrendered him, unexpected, to a witcher who came to call in a debt, and the life that followed was so thoroughly stripped of ordinary human experience that the word destiny sat badly in his mouth. He had no interest in claiming a child, in becoming responsible for a life, in being the instrument of fate for anyone. He said no. He walked away. He returned to his roads and his contracts and his silver sword. And yet the thread did not break. This is what the story insists on, what it returns to with the patience of something that does not worry about resistance, because it has existed long enough to understand that resistance is temporary. The thread stretched between Geralt and Ciri across the years of her childhood, taut but unbroken, and eventually the world itself would conspire to pull them together, not through choice, not through sentiment, but through catastrophe. Cintra would fall. Calanthe would die by her own hand rather than surrender. And a young girl with ashen hair would flee into a world that wanted her for reasons she was only beginning to understand. Let your breathing be slow. The law of surprise has done its work. It reached back through time and across custom, and through the resistance of a man who wanted nothing to do with destiny, and it produced a bond that would eventually become the most significant relationship either of them would ever know. Not father and daughter by blood, not guardian and charge in any formal sense. Something older and stranger than either of those terms, something that the elvish word for it, child of surprise, unexpected one, the gift the world chose to give, comes closer to capturing than anything in the human vocabulary. She was his, he was hers. The universe had decided this before she was born, and the universe, in this story, was not in the habit of being overruled. Ease into the quiet now. The custom is ancient. Its logic is older than logic, and the child it produced was already asleep in her grandmother's palace when this part of the story was still unfolding, still making its slow arrangements. Cintra was warm then. The wine was good. The harbour smelled of salt and tar, and somewhere in the walls of that place, in the blood of a princess who did not yet know she was a princess of more than one inheritance, the elder blood ran alongside the thread of an old promise, and the two things together were enough to make the universe lean forward with something that looked very much like anticipation. The deep logic of the law of surprise, the reason it persisted through centuries of social change, through the rise and fall of kingdoms that tried to codify it, and kingdoms that tried to abolish it, through the skepticism of rational minds that found it uncomfortably metaphysical, was rooted in something that every civilization that has lasted long enough eventually acknowledges: the existence of patterns in human events that cannot be fully explained by proximate causes. Not fate in the religious sense necessarily, not destiny in any way that required belief in a governing intelligence, simply the observable regularity with which certain kinds of actions produce certain kinds of outcomes, with a consistency that pure chance could not easily account for. The custom was old enough that different cultures on the continent had developed their own versions of it, their own names for it, their own ritual frameworks around it, in the same way that different cultures developed their own responses to the universal human experiences of birth and death and the transition of seasons. This parallel development, independent traditions arriving at similar forms, was itself a kind of evidence, not proof, but the kind of convergence that makes reasonable people sit with the question of what the convergence is pointing toward. The witches knew the law of surprise as a professional matter, the way they knew other ancient customs that intersected with their work. Geralt had invoked it before without consequence. The universe had not always agreed. The particular invocation in Cintra was different. Those who were present and who spoke about it afterward, and the number of people willing to speak about it grew smaller over the years, as the events in Cintra became politically charged, noted that there was something in the room when the words were spoken. Not a visible something, not dramatic. A quality, perhaps, of the air. The kind of thing that makes you pause mid-motion and then cannot be pointed to afterward. Several people reported the same quality independently, which is the closest that events of this kind come to verifiable evidence. Something in the room heard the words and agreed. The debt that Geralt carried after Cintra was not one he could resolve by simply going back and paying it. The law of surprise did not work that way. It was not a bill to be settled, not a transaction to be completed and moved past. It was a covenant in the old sense, a state of relationship rather than an exchange of goods, a continuing bond rather than a completed one. The universe that had agreed to the terms did not stop holding them simply because Geralt preferred to forget them. The thread was not withdrawn. It simply waited, with the patience of something that does not experience the passage of time the way those it binds experience it, for the circumstances that would make the collection of what was owed both inevitable and necessary. Breathe. Simply breathe. There is nothing pulling at you now from the outside world, no obligation that cannot wait until morning. You're in the particular kind of dark that belongs to stories heard late, to voices that come to you across the threshold of wakefulness and dreams, and you are allowed to let this one carry you where it goes. The world we are building tonight in the space behind your closed eyes is enormous. A whole continent of history, of grievance, of magic wearing thin at the edges like fabric washed too many times. Let it spread out around you as we speak of what the world looked like before one small girl with silver hair changed the weight of everything. The continent, as the people who lived on it called it, with the casual certainty of those who have never needed to name the only world they know, was in a condition of slow, grinding tension by the time Ciri was born. This was not a sudden condition. It had been building for generations, the way water pressure builds behind a dam that appears solid from a distance but is cracked through with invisible fault lines. The northern kingdoms, Temeria, Redania, Eden, Cadwyn, Cintra, and the smaller principalities that clung to their skirts, had been in a state of more or less permanent competition with one another for as long as any living person could remember, and rather longer than that. To the south, across the Amel Mountains and the Yaruga River, lay the Empire of Nilfgaard, and here it is necessary to say something carefully, because the word empire is a word that covers a great many different realities under one roof, and the Nilfgaard of Ciri's childhood was not a comfortable fit with the word's more modest applications. This was an empire with genuine ambitions, which is to say ambitions that extended past what it already held to what it believed it deserved, which was significantly more than what it held. The philosophical framework underpinning this ambition was sophisticated enough to be worth taking seriously, even while disagreeing with it entirely. Nilfgaard believed itself to be civilization. The rest of the continent, in Nilfgaard's self-understanding, was simply civilization that had not yet arrived. The North, for its part, had spent centuries defining itself in opposition to exactly this kind of claim. The northern kingdoms were not unified. They never really were, not truly, not in the way that would have required them to set aside the particular grievances and ambitions that made each of them interesting, at the cost of making all of them weaker. They were a collection of related but distinct cultures, each with its own noble houses, its own traditions, its own relationship with the mages who served as advisors and instruments of state power. They shared a general suspicion of Nilfgaard and a specific suspicion of each other, and these two suspicions did not always resolve into useful action. Into this political landscape, magic had inserted itself in the way magic always does in worlds where it is real, and cultivated and understood as a resource. It had become infrastructure. The mages who belonged to the Brotherhood of Sorcerers were not independent actors in any meaningful sense. They had their own concerns, their own rivalries, their own institutional memory that stretched back further than most kingdoms, but they were embedded in the functioning of the world so thoroughly that removing them would have been like removing the mortar from a stone wall. Everything would still be standing, but only briefly, and with great uncertainty about the outcome. It is worth sitting with the texture of this world for a moment. Not with its politics, not with its power struggles, but with the texture of daily life in the continent that Ciri was born into. The cities were real cities, with the smell of real cities, bakers before dawn, the dung of horses on cobblestones, the acrid thread of tannery work carried by the wrong wind. The roads between cities were long and poorly maintained and dangerous in ways that people who use roads today would find startling. Monsters were not metaphors. They were actual things that came out of the dark at specific hours and required specific responses, and the existence of a class of professional monster killers, the Witchers, was not a sign that the world had descended into savagery, but rather a sign that the world had developed a reasonably functional response to a problem that refused to go away. The Witchers themselves occupied a strange position in this world. They were necessary in the way certain things are necessary without being welcome. The way a doctor who delivers bad news is necessary. The way a gravedigger is necessary. People wanted what Witchers provided, which was the removal of threats that ordinary weapons and ordinary courage were insufficient to address. People did not particularly want the Witchers themselves. There was prejudice, some of it based in ignorance, some in genuine fear, some in the obscure human tendency to distrust those who are too different to absorb and too useful to eliminate. Witchers were sterile, as a consequence of the mutations that made them what they were, and they moved through a world that organized itself around lineage and inheritance while carrying within their bodies a kind of biological renunciation of both. Geralt of Rivia moved through this world as he had always moved through it, with competence and without comfort. He had the White Wolf's reputation, which was useful and burdensome in equal measure. He had Roach. The mare he named all his horses Roach for reasons he never fully explained, but that had the feeling of a private joke that had long since outlasted whatever it was originally funny about. He had Dandelion, the bard whose attachment to Geralt was one of the more inexplicable relationships in a world full of inexplicable relationships, a man who gathered stories the way other people gathered wounds and who wore both with similar cheerfulness. And he had, in the background of his thoughts, the knowledge that somewhere in Cintra there was a child who was by ancient custom his responsibility, and whom he had chosen not to collect. This knowledge sat in him the way certain kinds of weather sit in an old injury. Not always prominent, not always painful, but never entirely absent. The continent did not know about this. The continent was busy with its own enormous concerns, its border disputes and its trade disagreements, and its slow accumulation of Nilfgaardian pressure from the south. The continent had no particular reason to care about one unacknowledged child of surprise in a seaside kingdom whose queen was a famous battlefield commander known as the Lioness. Queen Calanthe of Cintra is worth pausing on, because she is the container in which Ciri's early world was held, and containers shape their contents in ways that are not always obvious until much later. Calanthe was iron. Not iron in a cold or cruel sense, though she could be cold when the situation required it, and understood cruelty as a political tool the way a surgeon understands a blade, as something to be used precisely and not enthusiastically. She was iron in the sense of a will that had been tested and found reliable. She had fought on battlefields. She had made alliances she found personally distasteful, because she understood that personal taste was a luxury that rulers could not always afford. She loved Ciri. This needs to be said plainly, without qualification, because the story of Calanthe and Ciri is sometimes read as a story of political instrumentalization, of a grandmother who used her granddaughter as a piece on a board. The love was real. The political calculation was also real. These two things did not cancel each other out. Calanthe saw in Ciri everything she had ever wanted for the future of Cintra, and she saw in Ciri's elder blood something that she did not fully understand but recognized as significant, and she protected it with the ferocity of someone who has watched too many things she loved be taken from her by a world that does not ask permission before it takes. Let the image of Cintra form slowly in your mind's eye if you like, or simply let the words rest without images, and let them become something softer, more ambient. A harbour city on the sea, stone walls that have been maintained for centuries, the smell of salt and the sound of gulls, and the particular quality of light that belongs to places where water and stone and sky meet at a point of ancient equilibrium. A young girl with silver-white hair running in the gardens, while her grandmother watches from a window above. The lion cub of Cintra, they called her. She did not know yet what the name meant, or what would be asked of the cub when the lion was gone. Rest now in the continent as it was, in its complexity, in its tension, in its rough beauty and its capacity for both extraordinary violence and extraordinary tenderness. The world before Ciri's story fully began was not a simple world, and it does not deserve to be remembered as one. It was a world in motion, grinding toward something, and what it was grinding toward was the fulcrum on which everything would eventually pivot. That fulcrum had silver hair and a name given in love. She was sleeping in Cintra while history sharpened itself in the south, and the night, as it does, held her without knowing yet what it was holding. The mages who served the northern courts occupied a position that was, from the outside, enviable, and, from the inside, considerably more complicated. They had power. This was not in question. They had knowledge that the people around them did not have and could not easily acquire, and they had the ability to apply that knowledge in ways that made them difficult to remove even when the monarchs they served would have preferred them gone. But power and security are not the same thing, and the history of the mages on the continent was full of examples of what happened when rulers decided that the cost of maintaining their magical infrastructure was higher than the benefit. The history was not reassuring. The world that Ciri was born into was also a world in the process of gradual ecological change that most of its inhabitants were not tracking in any systematic way. The monsters that the witchers hunted, the creatures that had arrived with or in the aftermath of the conjunction of the spheres, and that had established themselves in the ecology of the continent, were not evenly distributed. Their distribution followed patterns that the Witchers understood empirically through generations of accumulated observation, without necessarily understanding the underlying causes. The patterns were shifting slowly over the centuries in ways that suggested the ecological relationships between the species the conjunction had introduced were still finding their equilibria. Into this complexity, political, magical, ecological, economic, the question of Nilfgaard's ambitions inserted itself like a cold front moving into warm air, producing instability before it settled into its eventual form. The northern kingdoms watched the south with the vigilance of people who had been watching the south for a long time, and were not particularly surprised by what they saw, but who also understood that being unsurprised does not mean being prepared. They had been preparing in their various ways for longer than most of them could agree on. The preparations had not made them unified. Preparations against a common threat, when undertaken independently, tend to produce redundancy rather than coordination, and redundancy without coordination is a complicated thing to deploy when the moment of crisis arrives. Ciri was born into this world as a princess in a real sense, not merely an honorary one, not merely a social designation applied to the granddaughter of a powerful queen, but a genuine heir to a functioning kingdom with a real history and real obligations and real people who understood their lives as connected to the continuity of Cintran rule. This is not irrelevant to who she became, the sense of responsibility that threads through her story, the weight she carried for the welfare of people she considered under her protection. These are not simply character traits that emerged from her essential nature. They were also taught. They were the product of growing up in a court where responsibility was demonstrated rather than merely described. If you're still with us, and if you are, you have been patient in the most graceful way. Let yourself sink a little more. Let the weight of the body be fully surrendered to whatever is beneath you. There is something particular about this hour, this place between wakefulness and sleep, where stories become something other than information. They become texture. They become the soft architecture of the space you're drifting through. Let this one hold you now. We're going back to a harbour city. We're going back to a palace that smelled of the sea. Cirilla Fiona Elen Riannon. 4 names for one small person, which is perhaps the first sign that the world expected a great deal of her. Names in Cintra, as in most of the northern kingdoms, carried weight proportional to the number of them you had been given, and 4 was a number that spoke of lineage, of obligation, of a family's investment in the idea that this particular life was going to matter. Calanthe had chosen them all deliberately, the way she chose everything deliberately, and each name pointed towards something. Her mother Pavetta, her grandfather, the old Cintran royal lineage, and something older, something that Calanthe herself could not entirely name but felt the need to acknowledge. The 4th name, Riannon, was elvish. It was very nearly the only elvish thing in the palace. Ciri's earliest years are known to us in the way early years usually are in histories, in outline, in the impressions others carried rather than in the granular texture of lived days. She was, by all accounts, a child who moved fast and climbed things she was not supposed to climb, and asked questions with the fearless persistence of someone who had not yet learned that certain questions make the adults in the room uncomfortable. She was physically brave in the way that some children are, which is to say she had not yet fully internalized the connection between her own body and the concept of damage, and she ran toward things that interested her, without first calculating the risk. Calanthe watched all of this, and felt something between pride and terror, which is the particular emotional cocktail that tends to accumulate in people who love a reckless child. She rode horses early. This is documented, which is to say multiple sources agree on it, which in a world without journalism means it was memorable enough to be told and retold until it crystallized. She was given her first horse before most children her age had been allowed a pony, and she took to it with the kind of facility that looks like natural talent, but is probably better understood as a deep attunement to the animal, an instinctive reading of the creature's responses that allowed adjustment before adjustment was consciously planned. She and the horse understood each other. This would matter later. The ability to communicate with animals, to read their intentions, to exist in the space of mutual trust between a rider and a mount, this is not nothing, and in Ciri's case it was connected to something deeper, some heightened sensitivity that the elder blood contributed to the architecture of her perception. Pavetta, Ciri's mother, died when Ciri was very young. The circumstances of that death are surrounded by the kind of uncertainty that attends events that powerful people prefer not to have examined too closely, and what can be said with confidence is that Pavetta and her husband Duny, the same knight whose encounter with Geralt had produced the law of surprise binding, died at sea, and that their daughter was left in the care of a grandmother who was already carrying within her the accumulated weight of a lifetime of necessary losses. Calanthe did not speak extensively about Pavetta. This was noted by those around her, and interpreted in various ways, and probably contained more complexity than any single interpretation could hold. What it meant for Ciri was that she grew up in a court without parents, surrounded by people who loved her, and who also, with varying degrees of subtlety, were aware that she was not simply a child but an heir. The weight of that awareness surrounded her the way the smell of the sea surrounded Cintra. Present always, so present that it became invisible, something you only noticed when you were away from it, and suddenly found yourself breathing different air. She was the future of the kingdom. She was also, though she did not know this fully, the future of something larger than any kingdom. The living expression of a bloodline that had been waiting several thousand years for someone capable of activating what it carried. Calanthe tried to protect her from both of those truths. She tried to give her a childhood first, a real one, with the texture of ordinary experience, the smell of horses and hay, the sound of weapons training in the yard, the pleasure of learning to read maps, the particular satisfaction of doing something physically difficult and doing it well. These are small things. They are also the things that build a self, the experiences that give a person the inner weather of someone who knows who they are when no one is watching. Calanthe understood at some level that the person Ciri would need to be, to survive what the world intended for her, would need that inner weather to be stable. She was building a foundation, doing it with the urgency of someone who cannot be certain how much time there is. There was little time. The south was moving. Nilfgaard was not merely a political concern or a military one. It was an ideological one, which is always the more dangerous kind, because military threats can be addressed with military responses and political threats can be addressed with political ones. But ideological threats require a response that operates at the level of meaning, which is a level that armies are not equipped to occupy. The Emperor of Nilfgaard was a man named Emir var Emreis, and he had ambitions that were specific and enormous, and that included, in ways Calanthe did not fully understand yet, her granddaughter. The First Northern War, as it would come to be called in the histories written afterward, reached Cintra with a thoroughness that was intended not merely as conquest but as demonstration. The battle that occurred outside Cintra's walls was not close. The Cintran forces were brave and well led and completely overmatched. Calanthe fought. This is documented with the same confidence as Ciri's early horsemanship. Multiple sources agree, and the image of a queen on a battlefield is the kind of image that lodges itself in memory and gets told because it deserves telling. She was wounded. The city fell. And in the chaos of a city falling, a girl with silver-white hair was given a horse and a direction, and a desperate instruction. Run. Do not stop. Find the one you were promised to, the one whose name your grandmother had finally bitterly admitted, the Witcher, whose existence Calanthe had spent years resisting, because accepting it meant accepting that she could not protect Ciri herself. Find Geralt of Rivia. The instruction is simple in the way that instructions given in extremis are simple. Stripped of everything that is not immediately necessary, reduced to the bare survival requirement. Run, find him, live. Calanthe did not leave Cintra. She went to a window in the palace that was very high. This is not something we need to dwell on tonight. It is simply part of the record, part of what was lost when the world shifted on its axis. She was a lion who had no more options, and she made the choice that was left to her with the same deliberateness she had applied to everything else. The lion of Cintra died in Cintra, and her cub fled alone into a world that was already looking for her. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. This is a good moment to float a little, to let the story become something ambient rather than something tracked. The next chapter is here when you are ready. Sleep well for a moment, rest in the space between these words, and when you come back we will find Ciri on the road, cold, alone, riding toward a destiny that has been building for longer than she has been alive. Subscribe and come back when the next piece of this story is ready. The history keeps, the road goes on, and tonight, for now, you can rest. She was 12 years old when she rode out of Cintra's gates. 12 years old, with the elder blood in her veins and the law of surprise as an invisible thread, and the memory of her grandmother's face. Composed, deliberate, loving in the way of people who have learned to love inside the limits of what survival permits. 12 years old and already carrying more of the world's weight than most people ever accumulate in a full lifetime. The continent opened before her, vast and cold and indifferent, and she rode into it the way people who have no other option ride into the dark, with the specific bravery of someone who does not have the luxury of being afraid. The streets of Cintra on an ordinary morning had a texture that survived in Ciri's memory long after the city itself had ceased to exist in the form she had known it. The smell of bread from the bakeries near the harbour, which began their work before the sun, and whose output moved through the city in waves that arrived at the palace walls by mid-morning. The sound of the birds that colonised the cornices of the older buildings, whose vocabulary was as specific to this particular configuration of stone and sea air as any local dialect. The way the light moved off the water in certain conditions, arriving at the high windows of the palace at an angle that made the interior suddenly luminous, in a way that felt unplanned, accidental, like a gift the city gave itself. She was educated, as the granddaughters of Cintran queens were educated, in the things considered necessary for someone who might one day be required to govern. Geography, in the practical sense, the kind that a military commander needs, that tells you where the high ground is and where the water is and where a force moving from the south would have to slow down. History, in the political sense, the kind that tells you who has reason to be angry at whom, and how long ago the reason was created and whether it has been addressed or only suppressed. Language, which Calanthe herself had prioritised, having found repeatedly that being the only person in a room who did not need an interpreter was an advantage that bore examination. What the education did not provide, because no education in any structured institution can provide it, was an understanding of what she was. Not in the cosmological sense, not in the elder blood, chosen of prophecy, hunted by ancient riders' sense. In the simpler sense of who she was as a particular person, what she valued independent of what was expected of her, what she would choose if choices were genuinely available. This kind of self-knowledge tends to develop in the space between expectations, in the margins of the scheduled day, where the scheduled self is briefly off duty, and the actual self can move around and assess itself. Ciri had those margins. She used them well, in the particular way of curious people who treat unstructured time as an opportunity for discovery rather than a gap to be filled. There is a version of this story in which Cintra's fall is the end, in which the catastrophic removal of everything Ciri had been built within destroys the building along with the scaffolding. This version is wrong, and the wrongness of it tells us something important about what Calanthe actually accomplished in those years of building quietly before the walls. The catastrophe was enormous. The loss was genuine. But the person who rode out of Cintra's gate that night was not broken in the fundamental sense, not hollowed out, not reduced to a collection of reactions without a centre. She was devastated and terrified and entirely herself. The foundation held. This is Calanthe's real legacy, not the kingdom which fell, but the girl who did not. Let your breathing settle again. Feel each exhale as a release, something unnecessary leaving the body. There is nothing required of you in this hour. The story is moving forward, and you can move with it, or you can let it wash past you while you rest, and either choice is the right one. Some nights the mind holds a story, some nights the voice is simply a sound, a presence, a companion in the dark. Both are welcome here. The road Ciri rode out of Cintra has been long and dark, and we are arriving now at the moment where it begins to narrow toward a destination. Geralt of Rivia found her, or she found him, or destiny arranged their meeting in the way destiny arranges things in a world where it is a genuine structural feature of reality, rather than a comforting narrative imposed after the fact. The precise mechanics of how they came together, in what circumstances, in what condition, in what emotional state, is a story that has been told in many forms, because it is the kind of story that people who know it cannot resist telling, the kind that grows in the telling without essentially changing. What matters is simpler than the mechanics. She was alone, she was in danger, and when she found him she was already more than he had expected. She was not simply a child in need of a guardian. She was already, at 12 years old, someone. This distinction matters. Geralt had spent years refusing to think of Ciri as his obligation, which meant he had also spent years not thinking of her as a person. She was an abstraction, a debt he had declined, a figure at the end of a thread he had chosen not to pull. What he found when he finally encountered her was not an abstraction. She was opinionated and frightened and furious and brave, and already, under the terror of what had happened to her home and her grandmother, deeply, clearly, unmistakably herself. The self had survived Cintra's fall. Whatever Calanthe had been building in those years, it had worked. The foundation held. The relationship that developed between them was not smooth. It was not smooth in the way that the relationship between any two people who did not choose each other and are not similar and are both carrying enormous private griefs is not smooth. Geralt was not a man fluent in the vocabulary of care, not because he lacked the capacity for it, but because the capacity had been systematically discouraged by a life that had offered him very few safe places to practice. He knew how to protect. He knew how to intervene. He was considerably less certain what to do in the space between protection and intervention, which is the space where most of the actual relationship building happens. And yet something happened in that space anyway. It happened slowly, the way most things that matter happen slowly, through accumulated small moments, through the texture of daily proximity, through the particular intimacy of a shared road in a world that was frequently trying to kill them both. He taught her things. Not the formal curriculum of a school, not the structured pedagogy of an institution, but the practical knowledge of someone who has survived by knowing what he knows, how to read a landscape for danger, how to move without announcing your presence, how to assess a situation quickly and adjust. She absorbed these lessons with the same facility she had brought to horses, with the attunement of someone whose perceptual equipment was, at some level, more finely tuned than ordinary. He also simply listened to her. This sounds like a small thing and is not. In the world Ciri had grown up in, she had been surrounded by people who loved her, and who also, by the nature of that love and the nature of their own positions, had agendas for her. Not malicious agendas mostly, but agendas nonetheless, ways they needed her to be or believed she should become. Geralt had no agenda for her except her survival, which is both the most minimal and the most fundamental form of investment one person can have in another. He wanted her to live, and within that simple framework he made room for her to be whatever she was, which turned out to be quite a lot. There is a particular kind of relationship that exists between people who are not related by blood, but who have found themselves connected by circumstance, and who then choose, against the path of least resistance, to honour that connection, to call it what it is rather than something smaller and more comfortable. In the world of the continent, in a language that had words for most of the human configurations the world produces, there was not a ready word for what Geralt and Ciri were to each other. Guardian was too formal, ward was too passive. Father and daughter came closest and was also wrong in the ways that matter, because the paternal relationship is built on a continuity of presence and a shared history from the beginning, and they had not had that. They had something else. They had chosen each other inside the wreckage of circumstances that had not given them many choices, and the act of choosing under constraint is, in some ways, a purer act than the unconditional inheritance of family. It is easy to love what you were given from the start. It is something different to look at what has arrived in your life through loss and catastrophe and say, yes, this, I choose this. Geralt did not say this in words. He was not a man who said important things in words if he could help it, which was partly habit and partly the protective instinct of someone who had learned that words could be used against you in ways that actions could not. But he said it in every road he travelled with her, every contract he arranged around her safety, every moment he placed himself between her and what was coming. Ciri, for her part, responded to this wordless claiming with a ferocity that was entirely characteristic of her. She did not receive his care passively. She reciprocated it, awkwardly, sometimes inappropriately, with the excess of someone who has been starved of something and does not quite have the calibration right for how much of it is now appropriate to express. She called him father, eventually. Not in the first days, not in the first weeks. It arrived later, emerging out of the accumulated weight of the days between them, and when it arrived it did not feel like a title being applied but like a recognition being stated, like noticing that a thing was already true and finally having the word for it. The question of what Geralt felt when she said this is not one the man himself would have answered directly. He would have deflected, or said something terse, or looked away in the manner of someone who is experiencing something more complex than their face has vocabulary for. But those who observed them together in that period, and there were few because they moved through the world carefully, noted something that they described in various ways: a loosening, a quality of attention that was different from his attention to anything else, a kind of care that had no professional dimension, that was not adjacent to a contract or a silver sword or a measured tactical calculation about acceptable risk. He loved her. This is also not something that requires ornamentation to be meaningful. He loved her in the rough and inarticulate way that people love when love is not a language they have been taught to speak, when it arrives late and unannounced and has to build its own vocabulary from scratch. The relationship between Geralt of Rivia and Cirilla of Cintra is, in its heart, a story about what happens when two people who have each lost their moorings, one through the systematic stripping of ordinary humanity that Witcher training represents, one through the catastrophic destruction of everything she knew, find in each other something that functions like a home, not a place, a person. The thing that makes the road bearable. They could not stay together, of course. The world had too many opinions about Ciri to allow them simply to exist on a road together, moving from contract to contract, learning each other slowly, building the ordinary architecture of a life. What was coming for her was too large to be outpaced, and they would both need to find that out the hard way, which is the only way the world tends to allow for the lessons that matter most. But for a period, a real period, with real duration, real days and nights and shared meals and arguments about the correct way to do a given thing, they had this, and it was more than either of them had expected to have. Breathe. Let the story rest here for a moment before it moves. There is warmth in this chapter that the ones before it did not have, and there is warmth in the ones ahead that will be harder to find, so it is worth pausing in it, letting it be what it is before the road takes another turn. A witcher and a young girl, a silver wolf and a lion cub. Two broken loose things that had found in each other something that held. The night is deep now. Let this image be the last clear one before you drift. It will still be here when you come back. The road between two people who are learning to trust each other is a specific kind of road, with specific terrain features that those who have travelled it will recognise. There are stretches of easy movement, where the conversation flows and the shared task creates a rhythm, and the distance closes without being consciously measured. And there are places where the road becomes difficult, where something said or unsaid or done or undone creates a resistance that must be addressed before forward movement is possible again. Geralt and Ciri navigated both kinds of terrain, with the varying success of people who are operating with partial maps and limited experience of the specific route they are attempting. Yennefer's entry into the picture of Ciri's development was not, from Ciri's perspective, initially welcome. Yennefer was not a person who made it easy to be around her, at least not in the early stages of any relationship. She was precise, she was demanding, she had expectations that she stated clearly, and without the softening qualifications that make expectations easier to receive. She had no interest in performing warmth she did not feel, and in the early days of her acquaintance with Ciri she felt primarily responsibility, not warmth. The warmth came later, in the way that warmth tends to come for people who do not trust it to arrive without being earned, slowly, unevenly, and ultimately more durably, for having been built on a foundation of genuine mutual observation rather than initial affinity. The magical training that Yennefer provided was different in character from the physical training at Kaer Morhen. Though it shared with the Witcher curriculum an essential quality, it took Ciri seriously. This is worth noting because the world had a complicated relationship with taking Ciri seriously as an agent in her own development. Many of the forces interested in her, the NL, the Nilfgaardian intelligence apparatus, the various factions of mages who were aware of her existence, were interested in what she carried and what she represented, not in who she was becoming. Yennefer was interested in who she was becoming. This distinction produced a different kind of attention, and a different kind of instruction, and a different kind of relationship. Geralt watched all of this, the development of the relationship between the two people he was most deeply entangled with, the emergence in Ciri of capabilities that exceeded what he had expected, the gradual accumulation of evidence that what he had taken on was not a ward in any conventional sense, but a responsibility of a different and larger order, and he watched it with the specific quality of attention he brought to things that mattered to him. Not vocally, not with commentary, with presence, with the kind of reliability that communicates its own form of care, always being where he said he would be, always following through, always there when things went wrong and not making an event of the being there. This too was a form of teaching, and she absorbed it with the same facility she brought to everything else. There is something about the mountains that belongs to sleep, the way they hold silence differently from flatlands, a deeper silence, a silence that has altitude in it, that feels further from the ordinary noise of the world. Let that silence be yours for a moment. Wherever you are, let the mountains come to you in imagination, the cold clarity of the air, the way stone holds the day's heat and releases it slowly into the night, the particular darkness that exists above the tree line where there are no leaves to break it. You are resting. The story is carrying you somewhere high and old and cold, and it is beautiful in the way that difficult things can be beautiful when you are not the one being required to endure them. Kaer Morhen. The name means, roughly, the old keep of the sea, which seems strange for a fortress in the mountains until you understand that its name was given at a time when the landscape around it held a different relationship to water than it holds now, and that geography changes over the centuries in ways that make old place names seem like riddles, encoded messages from an earlier world. The fortress had been the home of the School of the Wolf for as long as the School of the Wolf had existed, which was long enough that the original reasons for choosing the location had become the kind of institutional memory that gets preserved as tradition long after the practical logic has shifted. It was a hard place to reach. This was intentional. The path to Kaer Morhen wound through mountain passes that were brutal in autumn and genuinely dangerous in winter, which meant that the fortress was, for all practical purposes, inaccessible for months of the year. The witches who wintered there were not hiding from the world in any active sense. They were simply in a place that the world could not conveniently reach, which amounted to the same thing. During those months, the fortress held its small population in something close to isolation, and the isolation had a specific quality that those who have spent time in remote mountain places will recognize, a quality of being both cut off and returned to yourself, of existing in a scale where the human social world falls away and something older and more elemental takes its place. Geralt brought Ciri to Kaer Morhen because he had nowhere else to take her, and because the fortress was at that moment the nearest thing he had to a safe place in a world where safety for her was increasingly theoretical. The other witches who wintered there received her with reactions that ranged from confusion to wariness to something that gradually, over the course of the cold months, resolved into a rough and undemonstrative affection. Lambert, who complained about everything with a consistency that was its own kind of dependability. Eskel, quieter and more observant, whose watching of Ciri had the quality of someone taking accurate notes. Vesemir, the oldest, the closest thing the School of the Wolf had to a patriarch, who looked at her and understood immediately that she was not simply a child to be sheltered, but a problem to be thought through carefully. Vesemir was old in the way that certain people are old, which is to say that the age had not diminished him, but had simply accumulated in him, had become part of his composition the way rings become part of a tree. He had survived everything that had tried to kill him, which in a witcher's life was a considerable list, and he had survived it by being, among other things, a very good judge of what he was looking at. What he was looking at, when he looked at Ciri, was something he had not seen before, and he was old enough to know that unseen things deserve careful attention rather than reflexive categorization. They trained her. This is the word used, and it is accurate in a limited sense and misleading in another. The Witcher training regimen, applied to Witcher candidates, was a systematic preparation of a human body and mind for capabilities that ordinarily required mutation. For the accelerated reflexes, the poison resistance, the heightened senses, the controlled emotional processing that allowed witches to function in situations that would incapacitate ordinary people. Ciri was not a Witcher candidate. She was not going to undergo mutation. The training she received was a modified version, adapted on the fly by people who were making it up as they went because the situation had no established precedent. What became apparent very quickly was that she did not need the modification as much as they had assumed. She learned the physical curriculum at a rate that astonished even Vesemir, who had seen a great many students and had calibrated his expectations accordingly. Not because she was naturally stronger or faster. She was at this point a 12-year-old girl with the musculature appropriate to her age and the physical conditioning of a pampered court upbringing, which was to say that she had a good deal of developing left to do. What she had was perception, What she had was the ability to read a body in motion and predict its next position before it arrived there, to understand the physics of a fight not as a learned calculation, but as something that felt, from the inside, like something closer to instinct. It is worth sitting with this for a moment, because what we are seeing here is the elder blood expressing itself in a domain that seems, on its surface, entirely physical. The enhanced combat perception, the ability to track multiple moving targets simultaneously, the instinctive understanding of angle and timing, these are things that witches achieve through mutation, through the forced recalibration of a human nervous system under conditions of extreme physiological stress. Ciri was arriving at related results through a different mechanism, through a genetic legacy that had been dormant for long enough in her maternal line that its reactivation in her was unexpected even to those who'd been monitoring the lineage. Her magic also began to manifest during this period. Not the studied, academically precise magic of the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, not the channeled and controlled application of chaos that mages spent years learning to harness safely. Something rawer and less manageable than that. It came in flashes, at moments of intense emotion or physical stress, as a kind of pressure that built until it found a release. The first significant manifestation happened during a training session, when the combination of physical exertion and emotional intensity produced something that none of the witches had expected from her, and that all of them agreed, afterward, suggested this was going to be more complicated than they had planned. They sent her to Yennefer. This decision deserves more space than a single sentence, but it arrived with the pragmatic directness of people who are confronted with a situation outside their expertise, and who have access to someone within their personal network who has the relevant knowledge. Yennefer of Vengerberg was, by any reasonable assessment, the most formidable sorceress currently active on the continent. She was also Geralt's most significant relationship, a connection so tangled with history and magic and mutual exasperation, and something that was at minimum the shape of love that the word relationship barely covers it. And she was the right person to take Ciri forward into the domain where what Ciri was becoming required more than Witcher training could provide. The Kaer Morhen months did something else, something that is harder to quantify, but perhaps more important than any specific skill it imparted. It gave Ciri a group of people who knew her, who had watched her struggle and fail and try again and improve, who had spent the cold hours of a mountain winter in the same enclosed space with her, and come to understand her the way prolonged proximity produces understanding. She had a family here, strange and scarred and not anything like what families typically look like, but constituted of real care and real presence. Lambert complained about her, and taught her footwork with genuine investment in her getting it right. Eskel brought her warm things when she was cold without making an occasion of it. Vesemir watched her with the specific attention of someone cataloguing something rare. She was not the lion cub of Cintra anymore. That title had died with Cintra, had been buried with Calanthe and the court and the smell of the harbour and the life she had known. She was becoming something she did not yet have a name for, something that the witches around her recognised fragments of without being able to identify the whole. A training ground in a mountain fortress is a strange place to find an identity, and yet people find themselves in stranger places than that, and the self that builds in difficult conditions tends to be more durable than one assembled in comfort. Let the mountains be quiet around you now. Let the cold air of high places come to you as a sensation, a cleanness in the lungs, a clarity in the dark. Kaer Morhen sits in the mountains still, emptier now than it was, carrying in its stones the memory of all the training that happened within them. The history of the place is long, and much of it is loss. But in this chapter of that history, a young woman learned to use a sword and discovered that something in her blood was extraordinary, and the extraordinary thing did not care whether she was ready for it. It moved at its own pace, as blood always does. The winters in the mountains above Kaer Morhen were long in the way that mountain winters are long, not merely extended in duration, but long in character, long in the particular quality of time they produced, time that moved differently from time in the lowlands, that had a different weight and a different texture. The days were short and the nights were cold, and the wind came off the peaks with a consistency that after a while you stopped registering as an event and simply accepted as a condition of the environment, the way you accept the presence of gravity. The human body adapts to consistent conditions by eventually ceasing to notice them, and in that cessation of noticing something else becomes available, the capacity to attend to smaller things. Ciri attended to many things during those winter months. She attended to the training, which was the stated purpose of her time there, and which she approached with a seriousness that impressed even Vesemir, who was not easily impressed. She attended to the other witches, to the particular way each of them occupied their own solitude, the specific textures of their separate griefs, the things they talked about easily, and the things they circled without approaching. She was, in the way of perceptive young people, with unusual social sensitivity, building a detailed understanding of the community she'd landed in, mapping its emotional geography with the same attention she was learning to bring to physical terrain. The mutations that made witches what they were had also, as an acknowledged secondary effect, altered their emotional processing in ways that the witches themselves described variously as useful, unfortunate, and simply true, depending on the mood of the speaker and the context of the description. They did not experience emotion with the full involuntary force that unaltered humans experienced it. This was not the same as not experiencing it. It was more like the difference between being caught in the rain and watching the rain from undercover. The phenomenon was the same, the relationship to it was altered. Ciri, who had been raised among people with full and unfiltered emotional lives, found the witch's version of feeling disorienting at first and clarifying later. There was a particular evening, deep into the winter, when the mountain was entirely sealed by snow, and the fortress had arrived at the specific kind of self-containment that only true isolation produces, when Vesemir told her something. Not in the formal, didactic mode of instruction, but in the quieter mode of someone who's been watching someone carefully, for long enough to feel that something honest is owed. He told her that whatever was in her blood, whatever it was that had produced the rate of her learning and the quality of her perception, and the episodes of power that arrived without warning and departed leaving her shaken, whatever it was not something to be afraid of. It was something to be understood. Those were different relationships to inhabit, and he wanted her to know the difference before she decided which one she was in. Stay with me here if you can. You are deep in the night now, and the story is moving into its stranger reaches, the places where the world as we usually understand it thins out and gives way to something older and less governed by familiar rules. Let your breathing be even and slow. Let the darkness behind your eyes be simply darkness. No shapes required, no images forced. The story will bring what it brings, and you can receive it with the open hands of someone who has let go of the need to hold. There is a thing the Aenale call the Der Gruadri, in the language they brought with them from the world they came from, before the conjunction of the spheres made all those careful separations moot. It means the Red Riders. In the language of people who saw them and survived the encounter, which was not historically a very large population, they were called the Wild Hunt. The name implies chaos, randomness, the random violence of a storm that strikes without selection. This impression was incorrect, and the incorrectness was dangerous, because misunderstanding what is hunting you significantly reduces your chances of surviving the hunt. The Wild Hunt was not chaos. It was purpose. It was the riders of King Eredin Breac Glass, the Enelay king, who had come to power through the particular kind of succession that leaves no ambiguity about intentions, which is to say through the removal of his predecessor by methods that were direct and lethal, and entirely characteristic of a man who regarded subtlety as a tool to be used when more direct approaches were unavailable, not as a value to be maintained for its own sake. Eredin had inherited a world, the Silver Twilight world of the Enel, with its alien geometries and its cold beauty, and its careful maintenance of a civilization that had preserved itself by becoming very good at taking what it needed from other places. What Eredin needed was a portal navigator. What Eredin needed, more precisely, was someone who could open doors between worlds reliably and safely, someone whose command of the spaces between realities was sufficient to serve as a living instrument of interdimensional travel for his people. The Enel had lost this capacity when Lara Dorren's line had passed into human blood and human history. The ability to reliably navigate the worlds had gone with her, and in the millennia since the Enel had developed workarounds, captured mages, temporary solutions, costly and unstable approximations, but they had never replaced the original capability. What they were waiting for was its return. What they were looking for, in their patient and terrible way, was the heir of Lara Dorren in whom the gift had fully reawakened. They had been watching the genealogies. This is the unsettling dimension of the Wild Hunt's interest in Ciri that takes a moment to fully process. They were not simply hunting. They had been monitoring, tracking the descent of Lara Dorren's blood through the human population, waiting for the genetic convergence that would produce someone capable of what their world required. They were not looking for Ciri because she happened to be in the wrong place. They were looking for Ciri because she was exactly the right person, and they had known she was coming, or someone like her was coming, for longer than Nilfgaard had existed as a political entity. It is worth pausing here, in the cold of this thought, for a genuine moment of sitting with what it means to be wanted in this way. Not desired in the ordinary sense, not valued in the way that makes someone feel cherished. Wanted as an instrument. Wanted as a key to a lock. Wanted the way a drowning civilization wants the thing that will save it, which is to say, with absolute conviction that the thing's own preferences are secondary to the need. The Wild Hunt saw Ciri as the solution to a problem they had been carrying for thousands of years, and the intensity of their pursuit was proportional to the duration of the problem. They had been patient. They were not inclined to continue being patient now that the answer had arrived. She encountered them first, not in any dramatic or prepared way, but in the way that truly terrifying encounters tend to happen. Incidentally, at a moment when she was already vulnerable, when the walls of ordinary reality were already thin around her. The Wild Hunt moved at the edges of visibility, in weather that was wrong for the season, in cold that arrived without the usual atmospheric signals. Their horses were pale and their armour was dark, and they moved through the world with the specific quality of things that did not belong to it, present but not entirely real, visible but in the way that things glimpsed at the periphery of vision are visible, registering before the conscious mind can process them. The fear they inspired in Ciri was not the simple fear of physical danger, though the physical danger was real and significant. It was something more complex and more destabilizing. The fear of being seen by something that understood exactly what you were, that had been looking for you specifically, that had a use for you that had nothing to do with who you were as a person and everything to do with what you carried in your blood. It is a particular kind of violation, to be hunted not as yourself but as your genetics. She was not Ciri to the Wild Hunt. She was the heir of Lara Dorren. She was a door that needed to be opened. This reduction of personhood to function is one of the story's recurring violences, and the Wild Hunt performs it in its most literal and least deniable form. What saved her, repeatedly, in the encounters that followed, was the very gift they were hunting. The ability to move between worlds, to feel the spaces where one reality bordered another, and to push through those borders, to disappear from one place and arrive in another, was hers in a form she did not yet fully understand or control, and its very unpredictability made it a defense as much as a liability. She could vanish from their reach. She could not always control where vanishing took her. The gift protected her by removing her from the danger and placed her in new dangers in the same movement, and she learned to navigate this the way one learns to navigate any system that cannot be fully controlled, with attention, with adaptation, and with a willingness to accept that some of what happens will not have been intended. The NLA world, the world the Wild Hunt moved between, deserves a moment of consideration separate from the terror it represents. It is described by those who have seen it, Ciri among them, eventually, with a consistency that suggests it was genuinely experienced rather than imagined. Silver light. Permanent dusk or dawn, the distinction unclear because neither sun nor moon occupies quite the same position in that sky as they do in more familiar places. Architecture of great age and great intention, built for bodies that move slightly differently than human bodies move, proportioned to something just outside the range of what feels immediately right. Beautiful in the way that certain very alien things are beautiful. Beautiful precisely because the beauty operates by different rules than beauty is supposed to follow. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. You have travelled far tonight. The mountains of Kaer Morhen are behind you, and ahead is territory that gets stranger before it gets clearer. This is a good place to rest, at the edge of the world between worlds, where the Wild Hunt rides and the spaces between realities grow thin. Subscribe and come back when the next chapter of this story is ready. It will be waiting for you, patient as old stone, certain that you will return. The hunt is ancient. The huntress is faster than they know, and the night, as always, belongs equally to both. She did not stop running. She could not stop running. But in the running, she was also learning the terrain of her own gift, learning the shape of what she could do when pushed beyond what she had intended, learning that power of the kind she carried does not come from stillness, but from movement, from the dynamic use of something that only fully activates under pressure. The wild hunt was terrible. It was also in a way that she could not have articulated and would not have chosen her most ruthless teacher. You learn what you are capable of when what pursues you requires your full capability. She was learning what she was capable of, and what she was capable of was expanding with every crossing, every transit, every moment of plunging through the space between worlds and arriving somewhere new. The Enel's world, the world from which the wild hunt rode out into the spaces between realities, was not a world in decline exactly, but it was a world that had lost something it had not fully replaced. The conjunction of the spheres that had mixed the worlds together, millennia ago, had disrupted the NLA's relationship to the pathways between realities in ways that they had spent those millennia addressing with partial success. They could still move between worlds, using methods that were costly and imprecise compared to what the Elder Blood Navigator had once provided. They could still reach out into other realities, take what was needed, return. But the elegance was gone, the reliability was gone, and reliability in the enterprise of interdimensional navigation is not a convenience but a survival requirement. Eredin Breac Glass was not a man given to sentiment, but he was a man given to strategy, and his strategy included an accurate assessment of what the NLA needed to maintain themselves as a civilization. They needed slaves, which was the ugly word for the humans they brought back from their raids to do the work that their own diminishing population could not sustain. They needed resources from other worlds, because their own world's ecology had limitations that the civilization's appetites had long since exceeded. And they needed a navigator, a reliable, powerful, living navigator who could move the wild hunt between worlds with the precision that their current methods could not match. Ciri was not a prisoner to be taken in the usual sense. She was infrastructure to be acquired. The experience of being hunted by the wild hunt left marks on Ciri that were not precisely physical, though some of them expressed themselves in physical ways. In a certain quality of attention she maintained in open spaces, a reflexive awareness of exits and approaches, a sensitivity to changes in temperature or light quality that her body had learned to read as potential signal. The deeper marks were in her relationship to certainty. Before the hunt, she had known what the future looked like in the sense that most people know it. It was a projection from the present, shaped by the factors currently visible, uncertain in its particulars but operating within a recognized range of possibilities. After the hunt, the future was simply open, genuinely and completely open, in the way that standing on a cliff edge makes the concept of the next step something that requires active decision rather than automatic continuation. She developed strategies, not formal ones, not planned in advance, but adaptations, ways of being in the world that reduced her visibility to things looking in from outside it, that made her harder to find through the methods the hunt used to locate her. She learned to suppress certain expressions of the elder blood in moments when its signature might draw attention, the way you might learn to walk quietly in a house where quiet matters. She learned to move through crowds in ways that dissipated her trail, to avoid the high, clear places that made her detectable, to read the edge signals of an approaching transit before it fully manifested. These were not skills anyone taught her. They were things she developed through the necessity of developing them, through the repeated experience of not quite being caught, and the careful analysis of what had been different in the moments of successful evasion. The night is very deep now. You have been travelling a long time, and the story has taken you through mountains and harbour cities, and the cold spaces between worlds, and you are perhaps more rested than you know, more carried by the voice than you are aware of in this moment. Let that be true. Let the listening be passive, and the rest be active, the way it is in the deepest sleep, when the mind is still present, still receiving, still weaving what it receives into the fabric of its own interior world. You're not obligated to follow every word. You're simply here, breathing, in the company of something very old. There is a figure in this story who requires careful introduction, because understanding him requires holding two facts simultaneously that feel, on their surface, incompatible. The first fact is this. Emir var Emreis, by the grace of the great son emperor of Nilfgaard, Dithun Adan Incarnate Morvud, he of the long titles and the longer ambitions, was one of the most effective political and military minds of his era, a man who had taken an empire already formidable and extended it considerably further by combining genuine strategic intelligence with the willingness to make decisions that most people would find morally untenable, and that he appeared to find simply necessary. The second fact is this: Emhyr var Emrys was born Duni, the Hedgehog Knight some called him, because of the curse that had been laid on him in his youth, a curse that had given him the appearance of something inhuman during the hours between dusk and dawn, a curse from which he had been freed on the night of Pavetta's feast in Cintra, on the night that Geralt had invoked the law of surprise. Emhyr var Emrys was Ciri's father, the emperor who had marched his armies into Cintra, who had killed Calanthe's forces in a battle that allowed no honourable outcome, who had set the cascade of events in motion that made Ciri a fugitive. He was the man who had been cursed in a Cintran ballroom and freed by a witch's intervention, and who had then, over the decades that followed, done something extraordinary and terrible with the freedom he had been given. It is worth sitting with this for a genuine moment, not with the political dimension, not with the military one, but with the human dimension, with what it means that a father ordered the destruction of the city in which his daughter lived, that the power that made Ciri's life a constant flight was connected to the blood that had made her possible in the first place. This is not irony in the literary sense. This is something darker and more structurally significant than irony. This is the story insisting on a particular truth about power and lineage, and what people are willing to do when they have decided that the end they are pursuing is large enough to justify the means required to reach it. Emhyr's plan, the one that underpinned the Empire's particular interest in Ciri beyond simple political domination of the northern kingdoms, was rooted in a prophecy. Not the prophecy of Ithlin, though that prophecy also circled Ciri like a hawk circling something it is not yet certain is prey. A different prophecy, one that Emhyr had come to believe in with the kind of conviction that is not faith, but calculation. The conviction of someone who has looked at enough evidence, interpreted it with enough intelligence, and arrived at a conclusion so large and so terrible that it becomes its own justification. He intended to produce, through Ciri, an heir who carried both imperial blood and elder blood. He intended to breed the most powerful genetic lineage in known history and use it as the foundation of an absolute empire. The architecture of this plan, laid out with the cold clarity that Emhyr brought to everything he undertook, had a logic that was genuinely difficult to argue with on its own terms. The elder blood conferred advantages that no amount of political manoeuvring or military strength could match. An imperial dynasty that carried it, reliably and concentredly, would be resistant to the kinds of fractures and collapses that had ended every other empire in the history of the continent. It was a plan for immortality of a kind, not the personal immortality of magic, but the institutional immortality of a power structure that could renew itself across generations, because it carried within it a genetic advantage no competitor could replicate. That the plan required treating his own daughter as an instrument rather than a person, as a means to an heir rather than as the heir herself, as a vehicle for a particular genetic combination rather than as a human being with her own interiority and her own right to a future she had chosen. This was something Emhyr appeared to have processed and moved past with a thoroughness that said more about him than any of his military victories. He was not a man who was comfortable with the emotional dimensions of his own history. The years between his time as Duni and his time as Emperor had required him to become someone capable of decisions that Duni could not have made, and the becoming had cost him things he did not discuss. Ciri did not know who he was for most of the period during which his forces were hunting her. She knew Nilfgaard as a threat, as an institutional violence that had taken everything she knew. She did not know the face behind the institution was her father's. This gap in her knowledge is one of the story's most deliberately maintained silences, held in place by the competing interests of everyone who did know. Geralt, who eventually learned the truth. Yennefer, the mages who had reasons of their own to keep various parties in the dark about various things. The gap protected her from a particular kind of anguish, but it also kept her unable to understand the full shape of what was pursuing her and why. The white flame was what his soldiers called him, Emhyr var Emrys, the white flame dancing on the barrows of his enemies. There is something revealing in the imagery. White fire is a fire that has exceeded ordinary combustion, that has moved beyond the warm familiar golds and reds of a controlled burn into something hotter and more severe. It illuminates with a coldness that ordinary fire does not have. It destroys more completely. The soldiers who named him this were paying him a compliment in the vocabulary of warriors, acknowledging a commander who was effective beyond the usual measure. But the image also captures something that they probably did not intend as critique: the coldness, the clarity, the way he burned without warming. There were moments, recorded not by historians but by people who observed him in less formal contexts, in the brief intervals between the performances of power, when something that had been suppressed in him surfaced unexpectedly. When his daughter's name was mentioned in certain ways, when the reports from the field included information about her condition or her location. The responses were small and quickly contained, buried under the imperial manor before anyone could be entirely certain of what they had seen, but they were noticed by those who watched carefully. Something in him was not entirely the white flame. Something in him was still, in some register that he could not fully close off. The young man who had been cursed and freed in a Cintran ballroom, who had been given a daughter he had failed and could not now approach except through the terrible mechanism of the power he had built. This segment of Ciri's story is the one that carries the most weight of human tragedy within it, because it is the segment where the personal and the political achieve their fullest fusion into something that is neither one thing nor the other, but some third thing, some compound of grief and ambition and love, warped into obsession that the usual categories of historical analysis are not equipped to contain. Emir is not a villain in any comfortable sense. He is something more disturbing than a villain. He is a person who made choices that made him capable of things that a different version of himself could not have done, and who is genuinely uncertain, in his deepest interior, whether the price was worth the purchase. Let that uncertainty rest with you as the night continues. It is not a comfortable thought, but the most honest thoughts rarely are, and this is not a story that has ever claimed comfort as its primary value. It claims truth, which is a different thing, and truth in this case includes the reality that the forces arrayed against Ciri were not simply malevolent abstractions, but people. People with histories, with things they had sacrificed, with reasons that made sense to them even when the reasons were monstrous. Understanding the shape of what was coming for her does not require excusing it. It requires simply seeing it clearly, in the dark, with the patient eyes of someone who has been in the dark long enough for their vision to adjust. The white flame burned in the south, patient and cold and certain. And his daughter ran, through the world, between worlds, across the face of a continent that did not know what to make of her. She did not know she was running partly toward him, that the father she had lost and the emperor who hunted her were the same grief wearing different faces. The road between those two truths was long, and full of things that would have broken someone with less of the elder blood stubbornness in their bones. She ran, she learned, she survived, and the night kept her. The intelligence apparatus that Emir had built to track Ciri, the network of agents, informants, and magical surveillance that extended from the Nilfgaardian centre outward through the northern kingdoms and eventually into the spaces between kingdoms where most networks did not bother to extend, was a monument to the particular kind of obsession that is organised and patient enough to look like policy. He did not speak of her casually. Her name appeared in the state documents under a designation that required a cipher key to read, and only a very small number of people had that key. The security around the subject was so thorough that most of the agents in the network did not know precisely what they were looking for, only that they were to report any credible information matching a specific set of descriptors without asking why. The mages who served Nilfgaard had their own understanding of Ciri's significance, which overlapped with Emir's understanding at certain points and diverged from it at others, in the way that the understandings of advisors and rulers tend to overlap and diverge. The advisors see the broader pattern, the ruler sees the personal stake, and neither quite has the full picture. The mages understood the Elder Blood as a magical phenomenon, as a concentration of chaos-conducting capacity that was historically without parallel in the living world, and they wanted access to it for reasons that were research-adjacent rather than reproductive. Emir wanted an heir. His mages wanted a subject. These were not the same desire, and the friction between them produced decisions that served neither purpose entirely cleanly. There is a specific kind of loneliness that attaches to power when the power has been achieved through the sacrifice of the personal. Emir had made choices that had closed off versions of himself that could not be recovered, and the closure was not entirely without cost, even in someone whose relationship to cost had been systematically restructured by everything he had become. He was the most powerful man on the continent. He was also, in certain configurations of the night, a man whose daughter did not know he was her father. and whose wife had died before she could see what her husband had become, and whose own sense of self had been maintained across decades of transformation by a discipline so rigid that its rigidity had become its own kind of prison. The white flame consumed. This was the nature of the fire it represented. Total, efficient, leaving nothing behind that could be used as a foundation for something other than what the fire intended. Emir's empire functioned on this principle, and Emir himself functioned on it, and the plan he had developed around Ciri functioned on it. It was a complete vision, internally consistent, strategic in every particular. It had almost no room in it for the possibility that the instrument of the plan might have a perspective that the plan had not accommodated. It had almost no room for the possibility that destiny, when it finally arrived at the place it had been building toward, might decline to run on schedule. You're very close to the end now, not the end of the story, which does not have a clean end in the way that stories in books have ends. It trails off into the open future, into possibilities that the world has not yet closed. But the end of tonight's chapter, the final movements before the silence. Let your body be entirely heavy. Let the voice be the only thing that moves in this moment, moving through the dark like water through stone, finding the path of least resistance, making something that looks like stillness carry something. You've been here a long time, and the story has been keeping you company, and that is enough. The Tower of the Swallow, in the original, in the Skellige dialect, in the coastal language of the island chain off the northern shore of the continent. It is Tor Ziriel, and Ziriel is also a name, an elvish name, meaning swallow, the bird of quick movement, of something small and fast that navigates between earth and sky, with a precision that looks effortless from below, and is achieved through constant minute adjustments that the bird is too small to make visibly. The name was given to Ciri by the NL, which tells you something about how they understood her even before she fully understood herself. Not as a door, not as an instrument, but as something in motion, something that belongs to the transit between things rather than to the things themselves. The period in Ciri's life that this segment addresses is the hardest. Not hard in the way that catastrophe is hard, not hard in the sudden, violent way of Cintra's fall. Hard in the prolonged way, in the way of someone who has been running for a very long time and has begun to run on reserves they did not know they had, and who finds themselves in circumstances where even those reserves are being tested to their limit. She was alone. Geralt was searching for her, pouring the whole of himself into the search, following every lead, calling in every debt owed to him across a career that had accumulated both enemies and obligations. But the searching and the finding are different things, and between them there was a gap filled with time she had to survive without him. She found herself in a place called the Rats. In the language of the people who had created this particular structure of the world, this means exactly what it says: a group of young people on the margins of the social order, surviving by means that the social order would prefer not to examine, operating in the cracks of legitimacy where the ordinary rules do not apply and where the extraordinary rules of survival have taken their place. She was not looking for family when she found them. She was not looking for belonging. She was looking for a way to continue existing in a world that seemed actively committed to making her continued existence difficult, and the Rats offered a version of that, imperfect and dangerous and temporary as it was. The time with the Rats is a chapter in Ciri's story that her later life would tend to move past quickly, not because it was not significant, but because it represented a version of herself that she found it difficult to reconcile with the versions that came before and after. She did things during this period that she would not have done in Cintra, would not have done in Kaer Morhen, would not have done under Yennefer's tutelage. She did things that the circumstances required and that the circumstances also, in some sense, produced. This is not an excuse. It is simply an accurate description of what happens when a person is stripped of their usual supports and thrown into an environment that operates by different rules. You become, for a while, what the environment needs you to be. What the environment needed her to be was harder than she was. Harder in the sense of surface, in the sense of the face presented to the world. Internally, and this is what the story insists on, what it returns to even in this period's darkest material, internally she remained herself. The internal continuity is the Elder Blood's particular gift in this context. The ground of her does not shift even when the surface of her is required to become something else. She carried Kaer Morhen in her body, in the form of trained reflexes and fought sequences, and the deep confidence of someone who knows how to use a sword. She carried Cintra in her memory, in the form of who she knew herself to be before the world decided to test that knowledge. She carried Geralt in the form of a certainty, not always consciously accessible but always structurally present, that someone was coming. The tower itself, the physical tower, the thing that gives this chapter its name, is in the mountains above a lake, in a region called Tarn Mira, and it is where Ciri fled when the last of her options in that particular corner of the world had closed. She was badly hurt. She had been hurt in ways that do not need to be specified to be understood as serious, as the kind of hurt that requires time and stillness, and the specific care of the body that the body demands when it has been pushed past a threshold. She found the tower empty, climbed into it, and survived by a combination of the Elder Blood's contribution to her physical resilience and something that is harder to name, a refusal, a bare stubbornness at the core of her that declined to permit the outcome that the circumstances were engineering. In the tower she had dreams, not ordinary dreams, not the kind that come from ordinary sleep, dreams in the way of someone with the Elder Blood, which is to say that the boundary between dreaming and perceiving was not entirely maintained, that what came to her in the tower had the texture of vision more than fantasy, specific, detailed, connected to things she had not witnessed and could not have known through ordinary channels. She saw Geralt, not in the way of wishful thinking, not in the comforting blur of an imagined face. She saw him moving toward her, on a road, with the specific weight and intention of someone who has located what they were looking for, and will not stop until they reach it. This vision, whatever its ontological status, did something for her that nothing purely material could have done. It held her there, in the tower, in the cold and the pain and the slow work of healing. It told her to wait. She waited. This is, in the context of everything we have discussed about Ciri, perhaps the most remarkable thing she did in this period. She waited. She, who had been in motion since the night she rode out of Cintra, who had learned to survive through movement, through the constant transit of her gift and her body and her attention. She waited in a tower in the mountains while the cold deepened and the lake below held the winter in its surface like a mirror of the sky. She waited because something in her knew, in the way the Elder Blood knows things that cannot be reasoned toward, that waiting was the correct response to this particular moment. He came. Of course he came. This is the story. And in the story the thread that had been stretched between them across years and catastrophes and the space between worlds did not break, did not fray to the point of failure, held. He came to the tower and she was still alive, and the reunion that took place there was, by all accounts, not a particularly articulate occasion, not a scene of beautiful speeches or perfectly calibrated emotion, but it was real in the way that only things that have survived being tested are real, not performed, not managed, simply the honest expression of two people who had spent enough time believing they might not find each other, that finding each other required the release of something that had been held under pressure for longer than was healthy. The Tower of the Swallow is the chapter in which Ciri is reduced to her essential self, stripped of the protections, the companions, the running momentum, the constant motion that had kept her from having to simply be still and be what she was. What remained when everything else was taken was the thing that was actually her, the irreducible element, the thing that the Elder Blood had been building toward through 4,000 years of patience. It was, it turned out, a person, a very specific person, with a name and a history and a set of loves and griefs and stubbornnesses that were entirely her own, that did not belong to the prophecy or the bloodline or the empire or the hunt. A person who had waited in a cold tower for a witcher to come over a mountain because she had decided that she was not finished yet. Let that be a thought that carries you into the final chapter. You have been here with her through a great deal of darkness, and the darkness is not over. Her story continues past tonight, past this telling, into the open future that the world has not yet determined the shape of. But in the tower, for one winter, she was simply resting, simply healing, simply waiting for the thing she was certain was coming, with the patience of someone who carries in her blood the longest patience on the continent. Let that patience be yours tonight. The story knows how to wait. So do you. The swallow always returns. It is the nature of the swallow, to range far, to move between things, to be defined by the transit rather than by any fixed point, and then to come back, to find the place where it is known, to land. In this moment, in the high cold of the Tarnmira Mountains, the swallow landed, and in the landing something that had been in flight for longer than a single life should have to sustain was, briefly, at rest. The night holds that rest now. The night holds it gently, in the way it holds all things that have earned the right to stillness. The elvish texts that describe the spaces between worlds, the transition zones, the places of crossing, the environments that existed in the gap between one reality and another, were not consistent in their phenomenology, which is to say that different accounts describe different experiences, different sensory environments, different qualities of time. This inconsistency troubled early readers of the texts and was eventually understood, by those who thought about it carefully, as itself informative. The spaces between worlds were not fixed, they shifted. They responded to the person passing through them, or to the conditions of the crossing, or to something that had no precise name but that functioned like the mood of a living thing, variable, responsive, not entirely predictable. Ciri's crossings were not consistent either. Some of them produced a sensation of cold clarity, like stepping out of a warm room into winter air, sharp and immediate and immediately comprehensible. Some produced disorientation, a loss of the basic orientation cues that the body uses to understand its position in space. Some produced something that felt like speed, as if the body were moving at a rate that the mind was having difficulty registering, and some felt like suspension, like floating in something that was not quite any medium she had a word for. She catalogued these variations with the systematic attention of someone who understood at some level that understanding the terrain was the first step toward controlling it. The worlds she passed through in her transits were not all the world of the continent. Some of them were recognizably the same world at different points in time, different configurations of the same landscapes, historical moments she was not part of pressing through the membrane and briefly visible. Some of them were entirely other, worlds where the atmosphere held a different composition and the biology followed different rules, and the sky was a colour that had no precise name in any language she had been taught. These glimpses accumulated in her memory as a kind of inventory of the possible, a sense of the enormous range of what could exist, what did exist, in the space of everything that the conjunction of the spheres had bundled together and the spaces between. Healing, in the tower, was also a kind of knowledge. The body knows things in the process of repair that it does not know in ordinary function. It becomes aware of its own mechanisms, of the specific pathways along which restoration moves, of the relationship between stillness and recovery. For Ciri, this awareness had an additional dimension, because the Elder Blood's contribution to her physiology included a resilience that exceeded ordinary human regeneration, and feeling that resilience operate, feeling herself recover at a rate that was faster than she should have recovered, feeling the specific quality of the Elder Blood's contribution to her physical maintenance, gave her a more direct and embodied understanding of what she carried than any external observation could have provided. We are at the end of tonight's telling, not the end of her story. Her story does not end here, or anywhere we will reach, before the night finally claims you entirely, but the end of this particular passage through it, this long and careful reading of what she was and what she carried, and what it cost her, and what it built in her. Let your body be fully given over to rest now. Let each breath be slower than the last. There is nothing left to track, nothing left to hold on to. Simply be here, in the dark, in the quiet company of a story that has been waiting centuries to be told to someone who would listen all the way through. The question that the story of Ciri raises and raises repeatedly is what it means to be destined, what it means to arrive in the world already configured for a particular purpose, already entangled in a web of expectation and prophecy and genetic inheritance that was spun before you drew your first breath. Is destiny a gift or a prison? The story of Ciri suggests that it is neither, or perhaps both, or perhaps more precisely, that it is a framework, a structure that exists independently of the person inside it, that shapes the space available to them without determining what they do within that space. The prophecy of Ithlin, which circled Ciri the way the Wild Hunt circled her, from a distance, persistently, with patient and terrible conviction, spoke of the end of the world as a real possibility and of a descendant of the Elder Blood as the pivot on which that ending would turn. The Elder Blood would be the salvation of the world or the instrument of its final destruction, depending on paths not yet walked, choices not yet made, the particular shape of a life not yet finished living itself. The prophecy did not specify which. This was, it turned out, the point. The prophecy was not a prediction but a possibility space, and the shape it ultimately took would depend entirely on the person at its centre. Ciri, who had spent most of her life being used as a variable in other people's equations, eventually reached a point at which she understood this, not intellectually, but bodily, in the way that certain truths can only be understood once they have been lived into rather than arrived at through reasoning. She was not the fulfillment of the prophecy. She was the person who would decide what the fulfillment looked like. The distinction is enormous. It is the difference between being an instrument and being an agent, between being played and playing, between arriving at the end of your story as something that happened to you and arriving at it as something you made. The door that she eventually opened, the passage through the worlds, the transit through the space between realities that the Elder Blood made possible in its fullest and most realized expression, was not forced on her. It was chosen. This is the central fact about Ciri that the story is most insistent on, that the things that mattered were the things she chose, even when the choosing happened inside a framework she had not constructed, and would not have chosen if given the option. She chose to go through. She chose what to do in the space between. She chose where to arrive, or as close to choosing as the chaotic nature of the spaces between worlds permits. She moved in the direction of her intention rather than simply being moved. What she found on the other side, or what she made on the other side, or what she became in the process of going through, the story holds this with an openness that is genuinely rare in narratives of destiny. It does not close. It does not give you the satisfying click of a mechanism completing. It gives you, instead, the image of someone who has moved through everything the world required of her and arrived somewhere that is genuinely new, somewhere that is not legible as either victory or defeat, somewhere that requires new categories, new language, new understanding. She became, in some sense, something the world had not had a word for, something between worlds, not belonging entirely to any one of them, capable of traversing the spaces that most things that live must regard as absolute boundaries. What does that mean, in the end, for the people who loved her? For Geralt, who had spent years refusing to acknowledge the thread between them, and then years trying to pull her back along it. For Yennefer, whose relationship with Ciri had become its own complex thing, not purely maternal, not purely instructional, but some compound of both that had acquired its own distinct character over the years of proximity and shared crisis. For Dandelion, who had been present at many of the turns in this story, and who was already, in his bard's way, sorting through it for the shape that would survive into song, they did not lose her, but they could not follow her. This is the particular grief of loving someone who has become something larger than the space you share with them. The grief of the fixed point watching the swallow range further than it has ever ranged before. And for Ciri herself, what did she find in the place she arrived at? The story resists answering this directly, and the resistance is correct, because the answer would reduce something that deserves to remain open. What can be said is this: she was, at the end of all of it, still herself. This seems like a small thing, and is not. The Elder Blood did not consume her. The prophecy did not overwrite her. The wild hunt did not take her. The white flame did not reduce her to a function. The road, the training, the cold tower, the space between worlds, all of it was enormous, and she arrived at the other side of it still recognizably the person who had ridden out of Cintra on a horse, frightened and furious and deeply, stubbornly alive. It is worth sitting with that here at the end of the night. The thing that the story is finally about, beneath all the Elder Blood and the prophecy and the political machinery of empires and the cold geometry of the wild hunt, the thing it is about is a person who remained herself, who was asked to be an instrument and declined, who was asked to be a symbol and refused the reduction, who was asked to be the fulfillment of something 4,000 years in the making, and somehow, in the fulfilling, managed to also be Ciri. Simply Ciri. The girl who liked horses and climbed things she was not supposed to climb, and asked uncomfortable questions and ran faster than the world expected. If you have stayed with this story all the way to here, then you have done something that deserves acknowledgement. You have spent a long time in the company of a life that is not yours, allowing it to move through you, allowing its weight and its beauty and its grief to be present in your body for these hours. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, one of the oldest and most valuable things that human beings do. Carry each other's stories for a while, be changed by them in small ways, return them to the world slightly different than they received them. You have done that tonight. You can set the story down now. It will be here tomorrow. If you found something in tonight's telling, something that stayed with you, a thought you will carry into the next day, a question the story raised that you want to sit with longer, consider leaving a word for us in the comments. We read them. We think about them. We let them shape what comes next. And if you are someone who comes back here for the long nights, for the slow stories, for the voice in the dark that knows the way through 12,000 years of history, then staying close wherever you listen to us means you will not miss what comes next. The story continues. It always continues. Now, let yourself go. The telling is done for tonight. The elder blood rests. The wild hunt has drawn back to its silver world. The witcher is on his road, and the swallow is somewhere between worlds, and the night is very quiet. You can be quiet with it now. Simply breathe. Simply rest. The stories will be here tomorrow. The history will keep. The lore is patient. It has been patient for 4,000 years, and one night's sleep is nothing to it. And now your watch is ended. Sleep well. If you like this video, let us know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. We're always curious about that. And if you have a suggested story, a lore deep dive you have always wanted to hear told this slowly, this carefully, this late at night, leave it in the comments. We will find it there, waiting like a good story always waits, without urgency, without impatience, certain that the right listener will eventually arrive. The question of what it means to be free in a life as constrained as Ciri's is one the story returns to without ever quite resolving. Freedom in the philosophical sense, the absence of all determining factors, the ability to choose from a genuinely unconstrained position, was never available to her, as it is never available to anyone. She had her genetics, her history, her relationships, the world she had been born into, the prophecy that surrounded her, the blood that ran in her veins. These were not prisons in the sense of things that could be escaped by determined effort. They were simply the given conditions of her existence, the way the laws of physics are the given conditions of everyone's existence. What was available to her was something more modest and more real than philosophical freedom, the freedom to decide what to do within the conditions as they actually were. This is, on reflection, the freedom that matters. Not the freedom to be anything, which no one has, but the freedom to be themselves, to exercise the specific agency that belongs to this particular person in this particular configuration of circumstances, to make choices that are genuinely expressive of who they are rather than simply responsive to what is being required of them. Ciri exercised this freedom, imperfectly and persistently, throughout the entire course of her story. She made choices that did not serve the prophecy. She made choices that did not serve Nilfgaard's interests. She made choices that did not serve the wild hunt. She made choices that did not always serve Geralt's understanding of what would keep her safe. She made her own choices, in her own direction, toward her own sense of what was right. The people of the continent who knew of her, in the years that followed the events of her story's central arc, held onto different pieces of it. The bards had her as a hero of impossible capability, a child of destiny who had faced the end of the world and walked away. The historians, to the extent that the continent had historians operating in any systematic way, had her as a political phenomenon, as the centre of a succession crisis that had nearly torn the northern kingdoms further apart than Nilfgaard had. The witches who remained had her as something personal, something they did not talk about in the way that people do not talk about the things that mattered most, the things so close to the centre that speaking of them publicly feels like a violation of something that belongs to the interior. What she was, to all of them, and to none of them in their particular formulations, was simply a person who had been asked to be more than a person, and who had managed somehow, against the considerable odds that the world had assembled against this outcome, to remain one. The elder blood ran. The prophecy resolved itself in ways no one had entirely predicted. The wild hunt receded. The white flame burned itself out against the resistance of a world it had underestimated. And through all of it, Ciri remained, complicated, imperfect, marked by everything that had happened to her, and shaped by everything she had chosen, and entirely herself. The story ends here, but the person does not. She continues, somewhere in the open future, being the particular person that the continent's full weight of history and magic and destiny was not quite enough to stop her from becoming.